Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Farwell. I'm Head of Charities and Education at Cowper Kreston. I'm joined today by one of my partner colleagues, Louise Holsworth, who also works with a lot of charities.
Good afternoon.
Across the firm, we act for around over 200 charities. So the purpose of this webinar today is just to flag up some of the big issues that we are seeing our charity clients facing. It's very much a whistle-stop tour, and we've got 30 minutes. So really it's just a question of sort of some of the highlights of some of these key areas. And in fact, each topic I think could well be potentially the subject of a webinar in its own right. So we've got a good mix of charity employees and trustees on the call. Hopefully you all see the slides on your screen, and you've also got the ability to input any questions that you may have on screen, and we'll deal with those at the end. So we've listed on this slide the 18 issues that we have chosen to cover. I won't read through all the individual items. We'll pick them up as we go. Louise is going to take the first half, the first 9, and I will pick up the second 9. So I'll now hand over to Louise.
Thank you. We're going to start by looking at cybersecurity and fraud. And we have to remember that trustees have a duty to manage charity resources responsibly and act with care and skill. Now, this obviously includes cybersecurity and fraud, and a recent poll showed that 69% of charities see fraud as a major risk. So it's very important that we strive to improve fraud resilience and develop a counter-fraud culture. Now, the potential areas of risk including theft, false payments, inappropriate supplier transactions, travel and subsistence claims is almost endless. There's lots and lots of areas where cybersecurity and fraud need to be monitored and addressed to obviously limit the damage that may result from any security fraud. So what does the Charity Commission say regarding cybersecurity and fraud? Well, we have a whole list of potential ways we can reduce the risk, including internal reviews, dedicated fraud officers, excessive trust complacency should be avoided, and just generally monitoring your systems to make sure that you are aware of the risk areas and the things you need to be monitoring. We also need to be aware that a fraud risk management procedure should be in place within your charity. This should ensure that you are regularly looking at things like bank reconciliations, ensuring duties are segregated. You haven't got one person doing everything, to make sure you can't falsify supplier documents, invoices, etc. Make sure that you do review your bank transactions and signatories for those transactions. We all get very complacent and leave things as they are. It's important to just make sure you do obviously keep track of the changes that are needed when people leave and obviously when charities change. So cybersecurity and fraud is something that is around, and we all need to be aware of it. So we do need to also bear in mind that if you do suffer any fraud, it may be necessary to actually report that fraud to the relevant body. And we get lots of advice from the Charities Commission website on actually the fraud risk management and the way it can be mitigated within your charity. The next topic we're going to be looking at is actually financial resilience and a charity's reserves. So resilience is what allows a charity to deal with the inevitable and unforeseen, and an ability to rebound from financial shock. Now, unfortunately, charities have been in the news recently for all the wrong reasons, and it's included failures in their governance, failures in safeguarding, improper use of funds, people being paid incorrectly in the sector, investments being made in inappropriate funds, poor commercial decisions being made, with lots and lots of charities being named as part of that exposure. Media coverage is inevitable. When they can actually say something bad about a charity, they're going to obviously grasp it. One of the big ones in the news was the Garden Bridge Trust failure with 53.5 million losses, which was in the headlines earlier in the year. Now, obviously, part of financial resilience is to make sure that you have sufficient reserves for the continuity of the charity in the long run. And the Charity Commission actually say that all charities should have a reserve policy, and it should be published in your financial statements. When there was a review done of recent financial statements, less than a quarter of charities had actually stated the correct reserve figure in their trustees report. Now that identifies a lack of understanding of what the reserve policy actually is by the trustees themselves. So it's very, very important to not only set a reserve policy, but also monitor and review your policy to ensure that it is actually still valid and it's effective. Large charities, those with income of more than 500,000, will also have to add additional detail about their reserves in their financial statements. Some charities may have reserves which are deemed to be too high. And if you do have reserves which are higher than what you state your reserves should be, you have to question your charitable purpose for those funds. Do you need to amend your objectives? Maybe you need to expand those objectives to actually cover other things to enable those reserves to be efficiently and effectively used. And if you have reserves which are below your reserve policy, there's obviously an additional risk to the charity and its longevity. Trustees need to address how they're dealing with this situation, how they're going to get additional funds or reduce costs, maybe diversify, but it should be identified and documented what the charity is going to do to reverse the position. We also need to be careful when we're thinking about reserves that reserves and cash flow are two very different things. You may have sufficient reserves as a number on your balance sheet. However, you have to consider the working capital, your liquidity, debtors' recoverability, and actually assess whether or not your liquid funds will enable your charity to continue, not just the reserves figure that you're reporting in your statements. So strategically plan for your reserves. Make sure they are relevant to your charity today and they have moved with where your charity has gone and is going. So the next area we're going to look at are risks. So what is risk? Well, risk is defined as the uncertainty of outcome. Now this can be positive opportunity or it can be negative threats. They all represent risks which charities have to deal with. And again, it's very important to identify the risks of your charity. They are specific to each and every charity, and again, you should have a risk policy and you should score your risks as part of your risk register. Again, they will change over time, and it's very important when you identify your risks to assign responsibility to somebody for monitoring and managing those risks. Now, those can be assigned to the CEO, trustees, staff, senior management team, whoever is the most appropriate person to actually deal with that risk. The Charities Commission give good guidance on these risks that we need to be aware of, and they cover 5 main areas. We've got financial, governance and management, operational, external risks, and obviously your laws and regulations. They all should be looked at on a regular basis and included in your risk register. The next topic will be property. Property in charities can be leasehold properties or can be freehold properties. It's common for charities to own properties. They can be for an investment purpose or they can actually be to generate income. Now, if a charity owns a property, it's also very important to be aware that if your charity is unincorporated, it is the trustees that actually own the property on trust for the other trustees and ultimately the charity. Now, if you're an unincorporated charity and you own property, you also need to be very aware of the legal requirements if you're disposing of any of those charities. There's extra requirements to ensure you take legal advice to make sure you are optimising your position with any disposal. Most property is either used or, as I said, is used to generate income within the charity, or is let out, which generates rental income or service charge income. You obviously need to be very careful about the treatment for VAT, any stamp duty, and obviously ensuring you don't breach any of the requirements or the legal requirements without fully complying. Any surplus properties that are going to be sold, as I said, in unincorporated charities need to be dealt with properly. If you have a leased property, don't forget you may have a dilapidation provision that you need to account for, and it's very important to check if you're subletting a property that your dilapidation provision doesn't actually revert to the original lease, which can obviously be significantly higher than what you may first think you are liable for in your sublease. So be aware with properties, there's a lot of complex issues that need to be addressed, and the most important thing is to take professional advice on all aspects of property where there is uncertainty. So investments, what can we say about charity investments and what are we seeing at the moment? Well, over the last few years, the low interest rates have reduced the returns for a lot of charities. This impact has had an effect on some charities, restricting what they are now able to do. This isn't likely to change in the foreseeable future, as we don't expect bank interest rates to go up significantly, and therefore charities are addressing sometimes the investments they're making to try and increase their return, which can have an impact on the risk of those investments. It's very important with your investments to make sure your investment policy is complied with and to make sure you are still investing in appropriate assets. Some charities are now very specific in investing in environmentally friendly funds to make sure that they are not in breach of any environmental factors which they are obviously adhering to. It is also quite important when you look at returns on investment to allocate correctly between restricted and unrestricted funds. This can be quite a complex area, deciding whether it actually falls as restricted or unrestricted. Mergers and collaborations. For the year ending March 2018, there were 81 mergers and collaborations involving 154 charities. 2/3 of those mergers and collaborations were really takeovers, smaller charities being absorbed into a larger charity, often because it was the only option for survival where one of the charities was in financial difficulties. Mergers and collaborations actually give a huge opportunity for charities to join together to combine and produce a greater output than the two individual charities would themselves. It's important, if you're considering a merger or collaboration, to consider the different cultures of the two charities that you're looking at to make sure you are addressing any differences before you actually begin the procedure of merging. Breast Cancer Care and Breast Cancer Now have successfully merged in April 2019 and show how successful these mergers and collaborations can be. The Charities Commission is encouraging mergers and collaborations, but however we are not seeing the number that we would expect. So if you are thinking about a merger or collaboration, make sure you take the legal advice to ensure that the entities may not be the same, limited companies, unincorporated charities, make sure they are all addressed before you actually get into the detailed discussions, because the chances of survival of these mergers and collaborations will be increased if you do your due diligence at the start rather than afterwards, when you realise actually it wasn't a good cultural fit and the two combined actually produce less than the individuals did themselves. So income generation has recently been a hot topic for charities. There's a new code of fundraising practice which came out in October 2019, which identifies 3 different aspects of raising funds. And the idea of the new Code of Fundraising Practice is to identify standards that should be followed when fundraising is undertaken. It ensures, hopefully, that the media won't be covering charities in the future that have been unsuccessful or inappropriate in their processes and procedures of trying to raise income. Charities have had to diversify where they've looked for their income as their returns on investment have dwindled, and maybe the public perception of charities has decreased, and therefore maybe less willingness to give without finding out a bit more about the funds they're donating. We obviously have seen a huge change in the way we report social media, marketing, etc. This is obviously a very good way for charities to expand the way they can raise income. Don't forget, with trading limits increasing to 80,000, a charity has more capacity to do trading without any corporation tax complications, but do be aware of the VAT threshold of 85,000, which would then require registration of VAT if it's VATable output. Impact reporting. Charities have recently been criticised for the information in their accounts. The public trust is very low on charities. Only 55% of the public trust charities. That's obviously going back to where we started with the bad publicity of charities and the way they have been managed. Accounts have been deemed to be inadequate for about 1/4 of the accounts that have been filed with the Charities Commission. Now, these have actually been inadequate because there's been documents missing, inadequate annual reports, they've been incomplete, no independent scrutiny as required. It's very, very important that we use our reporting, our annual accounts, as well as other reporting, to engage our stakeholders and to make everyone aware of what we're doing and how well we've been doing. And finally, we just need to remember the purposes of Charity Commission, which is to ensure that the public can support charities with confidence. So the Charities Commission have core strategic objectives to ensure we can rely on our charities. I'm now going to hand over to Mike.
Thanks very much, Louise. So if we move on to charity governance, I think one document that has become increasingly prominent in recent times is the Charity Governance Code, which is authored by a steering group of various important bodies in the sector. It's worth a read in terms of the position where you're considering your governance, just to make sure that you're doing all the things that you should be doing. And increasingly we are seeing charities referring to compliance with the Governance Code in their annual Trustees report. We'll move on now to trustees' skills and training. This is something that the Charity Commission has had a big focus on in recent times, because usually if something goes wrong with the charity, there's usually some sort of trustee related angle to it. Those of you that have listened to some of our webinars in the past would have seen the next 2 slides, but I think they definitely stand the test of time. So the traditional analysis of trustee skills is along functional lines. So we've listed there some of the key functional skills that's useful to have. In recent times, skills that have been in shortage have been around things like marketing, technology, fundraising and social media. And I think particularly with fundraising, where most charities are looking to recruit a trustee with some sort of fundraising expertise, but it's very hard to find those individuals. In terms of, if you are looking to recruit trustees, in terms of how you do it, I mean, I think still the most common method is networking, word of mouth, but some charities are using more formal methods, so perhaps using external agencies, or sometimes advertising in an appropriate newspaper or magazine can bring some quite useful results, and increasingly charities are actually interviewing potential trustees. If you're looking to sell to a potential trustee why they should become one, I think recent surveys indicate that 90% of people who were charity trustees actually enjoyed it, and 83% said that they had acquired new skills as a result. So there are some significant benefits for the individuals as well. In terms of perhaps a more modern analysis of, or a different analysis of trustee skills, we've listed on this slide some particular roles of trustees. This came through some work that Julia Unwin did, so you'll see a whole range of different personality types. So as well as the functional skills that we've just looked at, it's quite useful to have people who fill these particular roles. And it's quite interesting sometimes at those perhaps less exciting moments at trustees meetings, going around the room trying to work out which category everyone is. Some of you on the call know me already, so that's pointing in the direction of the wise counsel and inspiring leaders too, which I'm sure you would agree fit me extremely well. In terms of charity trustees, the average age charity trustees remains at 57, so it's quite difficult to get younger people involved in charities. I think I can confidently say that if you take Louise and my ages and divide them by 2, we're happily, in terms of the charities we're involved with, actually bringing that average down. It's now time for a bit of audience participation, so we're going to launch a poll, so you should see some questions on your screen. So with regard to the skills audit, so actually reviewing your trustees' skills to see if you've got what you need, you've got 4 options, so if you can choose one of those options that applies most to your charity. So we've carried out a skills audit recently, we're considering carrying one out, we've got no plans to carry one out, or our board is perfect already. So I'll give you a few seconds just to see if you can vote on these. This is all, of course, completely confidential, so you can say what you like, and we don't know who's saying what, so just give you a few more seconds. So some quite positive news there. I think the bulk of people around, getting on for 80%, have already carried one out or are considering carrying one out, and around about a quarter so that they have no particular plans to carry one out. Interestingly, that nobody believes that their board is perfect already, which I think is probably a good sign, because I'm sure there's no, of the 160,000 charities in the UK, I doubt that there is a single perfect board. So we'll move on to people issues. I think all organisations, profit-making or non-profit-making organisations, have people challenges. I think we see across the South East, retention and recruitment remains a key issue. I think for many businesses, they would see that as a bigger issue than Brexit, for example, along with other key issues such as funding and reputation. So it's important to have the right culture, to engage with your staff. So we're seeing more and more charities carrying out staff surveys, as we do see in the private sector. Salary levels are, of course, an issue, and I think typically levels of salaries in the charity sector are lower than they might be in the commercial sector. So it's a question of making sure that the people that are working for your charity are committed to it, and then therefore are perhaps prepared to work for a slightly lower amount than they might do in another organisation. Pension costs are a big issue, particularly with auto-enrolment and any charities that have got teachers, where there have been some big increases in contributions. We're seeing a lot more flexible working, perhaps to encourage and attract potential employees with family commitments. Occasionally we see charities perhaps not investing similar amounts in training in IT as we do in the commercial sector, but I think many charities are seeing these as really important things in terms of making staff feel valued and appreciated. So we always encourage our clients to engage with these issues. And like many organisations, mental well-being is a big issue. So to deal with issues such as long working hours and the pace of change in modern life. In terms of climate change, this is very topical. Some charities are obviously specifically involved in this area, but even for charities that aren't involved, it's a good way of engaging with employees and particularly engaging with younger people, which is sometimes a challenge for charities. As well as perhaps you may, depending on your views on climate change, think it's a good thing to be doing something about it anyway. There can also be specific benefits for charities. So we are seeing increasingly for charities that are applying for funding, that one of the requirements of the tender is that they need to say something about their environmental policy. Naturally, it can generate some savings in areas such as paper and travel. Typically with travel, that may involve some technology investment to allow things such as conference calls and Skype. You can also have an impact in a wider way in terms of influencing your supply chain, so asking your suppliers what they're doing about the environment. Increasingly, we're seeing charities actually have their own specific environmental policy, and it's a good thing, I think, to communicate the success internally and externally. we're also seeing an increasing number of charities including climate change as a specific item on their risk register. In terms of the biggest single issue facing charities perhaps over the last 2 years, I think reputation is right up there, and I think there are two issues. One is your own individual charity reputation, and the second is the impact in terms of public confidence in charities. Louise mentioned this as an issue earlier, so I think some of the problems at Oxfam and Save the Children, for example, have had dented the reputation of charities as a whole, and that tends to have an impact on many individual charities as well as the charities specifically infected. The impact can be dramatic, so Oxfam donations took a big hit after their problems. And in terms of the process for looking at reputation, it's a question of making sure you have the right values and behaviours in your organisation, naturally ensuring that you have processes and policies to deal with reputation issues, and also that you communicate the good work that you do. One of the benefits of communicating the good work is that you develop some goodwill, so that if you do have a problem, at least people are aware of what you do, and you can draw on that goodwill bank to help minimise the impact. And then finally, of course, having a response plan to any issue. So this is particularly important in a charity working with children and vulnerable beneficiaries, so if something does go wrong, you're able to respond quickly. And we're seeing many charities including reputation as a specific item on their risk register. So moving on to a related topic, I think the biggest issue that can affect a charity reputation is around safeguarding and reporting serious incidents. So it's a question of making sure that you're assessing that as a risk and dealing with it, looking at making sure you have a safe and trusted environment. And I think it's also important to remember that there are significant reporting requirements to the Charity Commission if something does go wrong. So serious incident reporting to the Charity Commission has increased quite significantly in terms of safeguarding issues in the last year. And I think the last figures I saw, the number of reports to the Commission has gone up by over 50%. So key individuals in your charity should be familiar with that reporting requirement. I think our experience of reporting to the Commission is that as long as you outline clearly what the issue is and you're taking some sensible action, usually the Commission doesn't get directly involved. Moving on to compliance issues, fundraising and GDPR compliance. Louise mentioned this earlier. So the Code of Fundraising Practice was recently revised, although really it was revised in the context of trying to make it easier to understand rather than any substantive changes. It's a question of making sure you have the right relationships with people that you're looking to raise money from. There's also reporting requirements for charities with income over £1 million in terms of needing to say information around their compliance in their trustees report, and I think even smaller charities are encouraged to report. Important to make sure that you consider the ratio of fundraising cost to income. So if you're raising £100,000, for example, from fundraising efforts, but it's costing you £100,000 to do that, that doesn't look great. So it's a question of just assessing to make sure that you've got effective use of your fundraising costs to generate income. The Charity Commission is quite interested in this topic. As far as GDPR is concerned, the big deadline for GDPR, I think, was the 23rd of May 2018. I think many people feel that GDPR is over now. Of course, it isn't. And really, having gone through the process to implement the steps to deal with GDPR, it's a question of making sure that you report breaches. If you're a charity or an organisation that has never reported or recorded any breaches, one perhaps questions either you're perfect, which is possibly unlikely, or alternatively that your trustees' employees have not fully understood or engaged with the topic of GDPR. Obviously, it would be completely inappropriate at this moment in time to make no reference to Brexit and politics. Clearly, there's a great deal of uncertainty around. You may, I'm sure you do, everyone does have their own views on Brexit. We try to just list here some of the potential impacts. So there may well be an economic impact, which may have an impact on public finances and beneficiary need. There's lots of EU funding, and it's unclear what will happen to that funding. If we do leave the EU, I think it looks fairly secure till 2020, but uncertain after that. There may be issues for some charities in terms of employment. There's some funding that the EU provides for volunteering, so for example the Erasmus scheme, changes to regulation and standards potentially around the environment. Political fallout, maybe that we get so obsessed with Brexit that nothing else actually happens in terms of other key areas. And charities have all had some information recently around campaigning and political activity. So the Charity Commission is not keen, for obvious reasons, for charities to get involved in political activity. So they've just given a reminder recently around that. We're going to launch a final poll now. So on the basis of what I've just said and all your other understanding, what do you think the impact of Brexit will be on your charity? So we've got 4 options: positive impact, negative impact, no impact, or I have no idea. And I know which my feeling is in terms of what the most likely answer to that question will be. So again, we'll give you a few seconds to register your votes. Consider it an early practice before the general election in a few weeks' time. Okay, so we'll close the poll now. So interestingly, nobody thinks it will have a positive impact. Quite a few people, and I think this is the one I thought was likely to be most relevant, have no idea whatsoever. Indeed, I have no idea. And sizable number, around a third, think it will have no impact, and a relatively small amount, around 20%, think it will have a negative impact. So that's your view of what impact Brexit will have on your charity. So in terms of the final slide now, we'll come on to strategy and flexibility. I think all of the previous 17 issues that we've raised lead through to this particular topic. So we're seeing that charities are carrying out very regular strategy reviews these days, rather than the good old days when they used to do it every 5 years. Lots of charities looking at scenario planning, so what would happen if they lost a major income stream, for example. So the independent schools, for example, are looking at issues such as what would happen if they lost their business rates relief or VAT was charged on school fees. Question of having a mindset to cope with uncertainty, which I think perhaps younger people may be better at rather than your average 57-year-old trustee. Lots of changes around technology and automation, both internally and externally. So just as an example, many charities are using sort of helplines and software-based products rather than face-to-face engagement. Changes in government policy and tax. Increasing philanthropy, if you can identify potential donors, that would be great news. Changing beneficiary need. I think we saw after the financial crisis 10 years ago a big increase in beneficiary needs. Charities reviewed their offerings in response to that. So, for example, some charities set up benefits as advisory services to help perhaps clients who are in financial difficulty, make sure that they claimed all the benefits they were entitled to. And then finally, it leads back to trustee and management skills. Clearly, and on the back of the issues that we've listed, and no doubt we've listed a few more, it's important that you have the right sort of trustee skills and, of course, management skills in your management teams to make sure that you can deal with all these challenges into the future. So hopefully, the last 30 minutes or so has been a useful sort of issue in terms of helping you just sort of maybe flag up a few issues that you hadn't thought about in terms of what their impact would be on your charity. We've had a couple of questions that have come in. So the first one is, have you seen an increase in cyber security fraud in recent times? Louise, did you want to answer that one?
Yes, Mike, thanks. We have seen an increase in attempted cybersecurity fraud, often to do with bank accounts, trying to obviously extract money inappropriately from a bank account. The good news on that topic is that we are also seeing a lot of these potential frauds identified before they're actually successful, which hopefully means that people are taking on board the risk of cyber fraud and are implementing the controls they need. So yes, there's an increased number, but a good response to identifying them before they actually get away with money.
Thanks, Louise. And I think I would add, in terms of any unusual emails or telephone calls that you receive at your charity, to always consider them suspicious and follow up, because they may well be an attempt to defraud you. The second question we've had is, how have you seen charities reporting on environmental successes that they've had? I think, if we exclude perhaps charities that are in the environmental sector as their primary purpose, I think we see charities reporting what they've done from an environmental perspective, both internally and externally. There may well be, as well as an expectation for donors to your charity, that you're doing something about the environment. I think you may well find that employees also expect you to be doing something about it. I think increasingly we are seeing charities reporting on the environment, perhaps a couple of paragraphs in their trustees report, but that isn't necessarily ideal avenue for disclosing this, but I think it's useful to make some reference. And then finally, charities are using a wide range of other measures, so they may put something on their website, for example, to indicate it, or other using social media channels. So a wide variety of different things. So I think that pretty much brings us to the end of the webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. If you've got any further questions that you think of during the day, then or at a later date, then do email us and we'll attempt to answer them. The webinar will also be available on our website if you enjoyed it so much that you'd like to listen to it again, but perhaps more likely it may well be that you have some trustee or colleagues in your charities who you think might be interested to listening. So again, thanks very much for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.